Hello and welcome to a very special edition of Liberty Nation's Swamponomics videocast. I'm Andrew Moran, Ellen's economics correspondent. Is this the worst US economy in modern times? The coronavirus pandemic exposed the fragility of the United States, the economy, and the financial markets. In order to bail everyone out, from Main Street to Wall Street to Washington, the Federal Reserve fired off the mother of all monetary stimulus weapons, creating $9 trillion out of thin air and injecting it into the marketplace. Fed Chair Jerome Powell and his merry band of central bankers also supported two administrations spending trillions of dollars in COVID-related stimulus. The results? Not pretty. Inflation is running at a 4-decade high. Scarcity of goods and services is the new normal. Food and energy costs are spiraling out of control. The red-hot labor market is beginning to cool off. The bears have devoured stocks. And this is in addition to the US government's fiscal troubles that will unlikely ever be resolved. What happened, what is currently happening, and what will happen. To help us navigate through the torrential waters and find safe passage on an island of economics, please welcome a very special guest, former Congressman and 3-time presidential candidate, Dr. Ron Paul. Welcome to the program, sir, and it is an honor to have you on the show.
Andrew, it's great to be with you.
So, for anyone who's watched the Ron Paul Liberty Report, who's read your terrific op-eds on the Ron Paul Institute, or just read your work throughout the years, you anticipated inflation for a while, even as everyone in Washington said it was transitory. What did you see differently from others exactly, like Jerome Powell or Janet Yellen, who say it's transitory?
Well, first off, I use a definition which I consider a more accurate definition because it comes from Austrian economics, and that is I don't think I'm sitting there anticipating that the inflation is coming, because what that suggests is that people only measure inflation by prices going up, but knew about the inflation a long time before prices go up. For instance, QE, that is where the inflation was. They were printing money like crazy and monetizing all these bonds and everything else, and that's the bubble part. So the inflation is there. It's not like, we might get inflation, it's going to be transitory. No, we've had a ton of inflation. We just haven't seen the full consequence of the inflation because there are benefits on the short term with printing money. It's counterfeit money, and as long as people take it, people feel good about it. But eventually it gets out of whack. The calculations and the interest rates under those conditions are fictitious, and so that gives a lot of malinvestment, causes the debt to go up, and causes these problems. So yes, we have price inflation now, but the real inflation has already occurred. And that's why they're tinkering with, I wonder what we should do. Should we raise interest rates? They talk a little bit about interest rates, but they have no intention on cutting down the incentive to print money. And that is deficit financing and a Federal Reserve that just accommodates the special interest and just prints as much money as the special interest demand.
And when you speak of interest rates, what's interesting is that they say, they're going to raise it 75 basis points to a neutral rate of 3%, but you still have 8% in CPI. That's still a negative real interest rate. So I find that comical at this stage of the economy. President Joe Biden, he recently and falsely claimed that inflation is higher in every other country. Now, perhaps he means Turkey and Venezuela, where inflation is 80%. So whatever the case, this was incorrect. However, price inflation is elevated all over the globe, from Europe to Australia to Canada. So is it the same diagnosis of this astronomical fiscal and monetary stimulus that has fostered this inflation environment all over the globe from the Austrian perspective?
Well, I think there are a lot of variables. If it were so simple as to say, the authorities had debt and they doubled the money supply, and therefore prices will go up and they'll double. It doesn't work that way. Sometimes the money sits around, sometimes it goes into savings, sometimes it goes overseas, because there's this human action involved. Individuals make these decisions, and that's why planned economic, the planned economies don't work. They always fail because they can't measure what people might do. And there's I think what I find fascinating in Austrian economics is the subjective theory of value. People say, well, we know what this is worth, and we know how many dollars there are, and we know this, and we know how many hours of work goes in. So with our computers now, we can predict all these things. The value comes down where the monetary issue is big and is an overriding issue. If you endlessly print money, you will eventually destroy it, and that's an economic law. So they can't change the economic laws, but they can't control the short-term problems that you develop, and because the variables are too great, and especially the big variable of the government, and they'll come up with all sorts of things on how they're going to contain, the prices from going up. And even now they hint at it, and you hear the president talking about it. Well, we have to set the price of oil, and they're going to lower the prices of oil. Those price controls is what have been notoriously used for centuries, even back in Roman times, and that became a vicious crime if you wouldn't follow the rules, because they thought that if we just control those prices, we're going to be able to solve these problems. So those variables are what's difficult. And one variable that I think is much more significant than most people realize, most people even that don't accept what I'm saying, basically, they would say, yeah, we understand. If you print too much money, that's sort of like counterfeit. But what they ignore, they don't even ever consider the interference on interest rates. The price of money, the natural interest rate is so important. It tells you what's going on, what the investments are doing, how much savings there are, it guides the economy. It's one of those invisible hands that helps work it out. And what happens is when the government just controls the interest rates, they have malinvestment, and the debt they have to say doesn't matter, because Keynesianism says, oh, don't worry about the deficits. We just run up the deficit, and just look at what they've done since COVID. Deficits by Republicans and Democrats have been continuously run up. But even with the ordinary manipulation of the monetary system and increasing the money supply and messing around with the interest rates, you have the malinvestment. That's why if money is readily available, is not guided by some common sense, then they overbuild. For instance, they might build too many hotels, or they might buy too much land in certain areas. So because there's a subjective element there, and a little bit of, it's not perfect. The interest rate is not perfect, but it gives tremendous help in guiding the businessman what to do. So we get rid of the guidance of what is necessary to have a healthy economy. And when they really get busy and inflate like they have, with the war going on and with COVID, there's so much malinvestment out there, mainly because so much money just goes into weaponry. And then they have other regulations like lockdown for the virus, and that is so confusing. So it's not oh, don't sweat it, prices are going up, that's the inflation, transitory, it'll go away. Well, if they continue to do exactly what they're doing, it'll go away, but it's going to go away with a big bang, because the whole thing will collapse if they don't adjust it. And right now, I don't have much optimism that there'll be any wisdom come to Washington, D.C. or to the central bank. They're not going to change their way, and that's why I tell people they need to get prepared and understand what's happening, because this system is very precarious.
If I may just touch upon your point of interest rates, do you think the U.S. economy is at a point of no return of having a market-oriented interest rate? The economy has been so dependent on debt and the Federal Reserve intervention. The whole economy is just a bunch of addicts waiting for the next fix. So do you think it's just too late now for market rates, or is it just, can it happen at any time? What's your take?
Oh, well, it's going to be tough. There probably are bits and pieces of interest rates, probably on individuals. If the government says the mortgage rate is 2%, and two individuals get together, they might decide on a higher interest rate, So it exists. I think credit card interest is probably closer to a market rate, just because it would be so, the credit company and the banks won't take that type of risk. So it isn't clean that they control everything. But no, and the transition, let's say that we talk the people into believing what we're talking about. You can't turn a switch. You can't say, well, tomorrow the Federal Reserve is out of business, which wouldn't be a bad idea. but it's not. It would not be smooth. It would be very, very rocky. So that's one reason why, if we ever got willing to do it, I think of transitions like just legalizing competition with the system. Let something work parallel to the dollar Federal Reserve system. But right now it's tough. I mean, look, a couple of years ago, they tried to raise interest rates and that didn't work. And right now they're in the middle of it. Now they don't know whether the proper increase in rate is 0.5 or 0.75. That gets so silly.
Yeah. When
you already mentioned it, the prices, they admit the prices are going up 8%, which means they're probably going up 12%. And it's just a bit of silliness that goes on. But I sometimes admire the individual who wants to maintain honesty in his business and tries to do the best thing to make the economic calculation with information that is not worth anything. I think the definition of the unit of account, how can you define the currency? Doesn't mean the currency have to be rigid. If you have a gold standard, it can't be rigid in price. It just has to be rigid in definition, because even under a gold standard, gold comes and goes, and supplies shift and this sort of thing. So you have to have a flexibility in it. But that is what they need. We need to have the information, and we don't have the information right now because of the interest rates, because of government regulations and rules, and all of a sudden we have this tremendous problem in energy. Doing all the dumb things in the world and saying, well, we're going to get all our energy from electric cars, and it turns out that electric cars, I saw something the other day that convinced me that electric cars and electric batteries, consume more hydrocarbons than gasoline. And I just happen to believe that, but I don't believe in the intervention, but it is, but that doesn't mean that libertarians have to give up on the environment or anything else. It's just done differently. It's done not by bureaucrats who make rules that aren't correct. It's central economic planning in all things, central economic planning in the economy, devising a system where they know how much money is necessary and what the interest rate should be and how it should be spent. See, that why anybody continues to pursue that is just bewildering, because it has failed so many times. Now we're in a transition, but it's not the transitory thing that they were telling us about. It's a transition into something much worse, because we have not come close to even dealing with the real problem.
A quick thing you mentioned about electric vehicles. I don't know if you saw this. There was a Democratic congresswoman a few weeks ago, and she said that she was able to drive through the country in her electric vehicle and avoid paying these high gas prices. And she thinks everyone else should do the same thing. But if everyone drove an electric vehicle right now, the power grid would be such under strain. The state's already having trouble, keeping the lights on with under the current system. So just on the final subject of inflation. Inflation is so broad-based right now. It's entrenched in the economy, in every sector of the economy. Do you think there's any chance at all that the central bank or anyone else can cure inflation at this point?
Not now. Not easily. They can, if they devised a 3-year period and just change their tune. Now, one example that you can look at in our history, but things weren't nearly as bad as they were after the Civil War. Because they suspended the gold standard and they had greenbacks, and things weren't doing real well after the Civil War. So by 1875, they had the Resumption Act. They said we're going to quit printing greenbacks, and We don't have a central bank. We're not going to regulate interest rates. And we weren't in foreign wars. We didn't have a runaway welfare state. And so they said in 3 years, we're going to resume convertibility at $20 an ounce. And they lived within the rules. They didn't continue to spend more than they had. They didn't go looking for wars to start. And that day of resumption was uneventful because the conditions were different. The people believed the government. They weren't on a welfare warfare state. And it is an example of it could happen. But see, the reason why I don't think that's going to happen because I don't believe the government, neither do most people in this country. They're not going to believe the government that all of a sudden, matter of fact, the people who believed it would be hysterical. What will the military industrial complex say? They would really be upset. And how about the pharmaceutical industry? What about the people on food stamps? Everybody would go nuts with that. So that's not going to happen. So to me, it's back to trying to educate people to understand why the pain and suffering is coming. What are you going to do about it? Are we going to have a period of time where we can resume or devise a system that was more like what we had once a long time ago? The beginning of our country, they had just gone through the runaway inflation of the Continental, and that's why they were very careful about the Constitution, that you couldn't use paper money, no bills of credit. And you could only use gold and silver as legal tender. But we're not at that stage. So to me, it's an educational fight because we've been putting up for nearly 100 years of bad education in our university. That's why I'm delighted to meet people like you. You're trying to reach out, and talk about sensible economics, because that's the only thing right now that will set the stage and to do the right things. And it's not the effect of what all of us try to do. We don't have to wait until we get a vote out there and 51% of the people. Democracy says we want the gold standard. It doesn't work that way. But if you get 8 or 10% of the people, understanding what we're talking about, and they get in positions of influence, what if they were in the universities? What if there was a natural transition that individuals that had been exposed to and trained at the Mises University were then becoming teachers and congressmen and judges? The world would be different. So the battle is intellectual. It's an ideological fight. And everybody has a way of making these points because we have truth on our sides, and it's logical. It's so wonderful to think, well, you mean we wouldn't have inflation? Do you mean that we're less likely to fight wars? It just goes on, and we would have civil liberties? Wow. What do we have to do to understand this? Just follow one rule. You're not allowed to hurt other people. You can't hurt people. You can't steal from other people. You can't do do anything that is harmful to people. And if you make a contract, you have to live up to it. And all of a sudden, you could have a wonderful society. Not perfect, because the people won't be perfect, but you wouldn't have to look at what we're facing right now, which it could be, if we don't wise up pretty soon, the United States could look worse than Zimbabwe and Venezuela. And just think of many examples that happened, in the last couple hundred years. But it's been around for so long. It's been around for really 1,000 years. The natural tendency for the human being to take advantage of control of the money and then debasing currency. It's a cheap way of gaining power. And libertarians have to give up on the idea that power is not what we're looking for. What we're looking for is freedom.
You mentioned Zimbabwe. I don't know if you've seen the reports, but the Zimbabwe government and the central bank, they're going to start selling gold coins, and you can be using it to buy for transactions and exchanging for local currencies. So maybe some sound economics is going to come to that the former breadbasket of Africa.
Yeah, and that sounds like competition. You get currency, so that would be it. My bill that I put in Congress was to get rid of the monopoly control, of of the Federal Reserve over the dollar. Remember, during one of the campaigns, a private individual started minting coins, and he put my image on there, and he called it a dollar. And I think they stole it. The government took his gold, and they either threatened or put him in jail because he was competing with. He wasn't allowed to use the word dollar. He was competing with the Federal Reserve, so they were very protective of that. But if you had an atmosphere where you could use things, see, when the societies break down, which has happened many times during wartime, currencies bite the dust. Then they have to use something of value. They pick out something. But if you had that legal already, maybe more people. There's a lot of people now that own silver coins, and I think the average person still should consider, old silver, what they call junk silver, and also just regular silver coins today. The silver eagle, even though that is a government coin, but if you could have that and then allow, private minting of those things, there'd be a lot more people prepared. Right now, what determines how long the chaos will last is how many people will be responding to what we're talking about, and how many people we can get prepared, intellectually as well as financially. Because if they're not prepared, then there will be a lot more chaos, because the haves and the have-nots will get into some very tough fighting.
Has America turned into an inflation nation? Has the consumer price index peaked? The next several months should be compelling for businesses, consumers, investors, and politicians. In the second part of our special edition of Swamponomics TV, Dr. Paul discusses the Federal Reserve System. Stay tuned, and thank you.
We're doing it for real, really real. Liberty Nation.
And Jeff Charles, contributor for LibertyNation.com.
I think we're starting to make an impact. Liberty style, fighting for freedom.
The tracking poll sponsored by Liberty Nation for Thursday.
Mentioned by Dan Bongino, Rasmussen, Jordan Peterson, and
I
others.
can do it again if you want me to.
Cited in Mark Levin's American Marxism.
I think we're starting to make a real big impact. Get noticed. We're doing it. Rock on. I'm gone.